They left me to freeze outside, so I froze their inheritance. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the cracked pavement of St. Mary's Hospital parking lot. Eleanor Westbrook adjusted her scarf against the autumn chill as she stepped out of the automatic doors, gripping her cane with both hands. The hospital had been a sterile cocoon for the past 3 days, a place where time seemed to stretch endlessly and every beep of machinery echoed too loudly in her ears. But now, standing on the threshold of homecoming, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar unease settle over her like a heavy woolen shawl. Her son, Mark, was supposed to pick her up today. He'd promised. "I'll be there, Mom," he'd said during their last phone call 2 days ago, his voice warm but distracted. That promise had buoyed her through hours of physical therapy exercises and sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling tiles above her bed. It wasn't just about needing someone to drive her back. It was about belonging, connection, family. But instead of Mark waiting by the curb, it was Jenna, his wife of 25 years, who sat behind the wheel of their silver SUV. She tapped her fingers impatiently on the steering wheel when she saw Eleanor emerge from the hospital entrance. Even from this distance, Eleanor could read the tension etched into Jenna's face, the tight press of her lips, the way her eyes darted toward the road rather than meeting hers. Eleanor hesitated for a moment before hobbling toward the car, each step sending a sharp twinge through her hip. As she opened the passenger door, Jenna gave her a curt nod, but didn't offer assistance or even a smile. Instead, she immediately pulled away from the curb once Eleanor buckled herself in. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. The silence between them was brittle, filled only by the hum of tires against the asphalt and the occasional honk of distant traffic. Finally, Jenna broke the quiet, her tone clipped and businesslike. "Mark couldn't make it. Something came up at work." Eleanor glanced sideways at her daughter-in-law, searching for any flicker of apology or regret. There was none. "Oh," she murmured softly, clutching her purse tighter in her lap. "Well, I'm grateful you came." Jenna's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. "Don't mention it." They drove another mile before Jenna cleared her throat and added almost reluctantly, "Listen, Eleanor, we need to talk." Her words were measured, deliberate, as though she'd rehearsed them beforehand. Eleanor's heart sank, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "All right. It's about coming home," Jenna continued without looking at her. "You can't stay with us right now. The kids are sick. Emma has strep throat, and Jake's got some kind of stomach bug. We don't want to risk exposing you, especially after everything that happened." Eleanor blinked, her grip tightening further on her cane. "I see. It's not personal," Jenna said quickly, perhaps sensing the hurt creeping into Eleanor's voice. "It's just practical. You understand, don't you?" Practical. The words stung more than Eleanor cared to admit. Practicality hadn't stopped her from raising 2 children alone after her husband passed away 40 years ago. Practicality hadn't kept her from driving 8 hours to visit Mark and Jenna when Emma was born prematurely. And yet here she was, being turned away under the guise of logic and reason. "I do understand," Eleanor replied evenly, though her throat tightened with emotion. "But if I may ask, where exactly am I supposed to go?" Jenna hesitated, clearly unprepared for this question. "We figured you could check into a hotel for a few days, just until the kids recover. Mark will help cover the cost, of course." "A hotel," Eleanor repeated flatly. At 78 years old, recovering from a fall, facing the prospect of spending nights alone in a sterile room while her family remained safely tucked away in their suburban haven, it all felt unbearably cruel. Yet what choice did she have? Arguing would only make things worse, deepen the chasm that already existed between them. "Very well," Eleanor said finally, forcing a small, resigned smile. "If that's what's best for everyone." Jenna exhaled audibly, relief evident in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. "Thank you for understanding, Eleanor. Really." The rest of the ride passed in silence, broken only by the rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers as light rain began to fall. When they arrived at the modest chain hotel near the highway exit, Jenna helped Eleanor gather her belongings from the trunk, though her movements were brisk, almost mechanical. She lingered awkwardly by the car as Eleanor shuffled toward the lobby, offering one final parting remark. "I'll call tomorrow to check on you," Jenna promised, though her tone suggested it was more obligation than genuine concern. Eleanor nodded politely, refusing to let her disappointment show. "Take care of yourself and the children." And with that, Jenna sped off, leaving Eleanor standing alone beneath the hotel's awning, clutching her suitcase and cane. Raindrops pattered gently against the pavement, mingling with the tears she refused to shed. For the first time in decades, she felt truly untethered, a fragile leaf caught in a storm, unsure where it might land next. The hotel room had been a temporary refuge, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to stay there, not when her own home was only 20 minutes away. She'd lived in that modest brick house on Maplewood Lane for 45 years, raising her children within its walls and filling it with memories both joyful and sorrowful. It wasn't just a building, it was a part of her soul. So after Jenna's abrupt departure, Eleanor had called a taxi. Her hip ached fiercely as she climbed into the back seat, clutching the blanket from the hospital bed around her shoulders like armor against the world. The driver gave her sympathetic glances in the rearview mirror but said little, sensing her quiet despair. When they arrived at her house, Eleanor paid him with trembling hands and slowly made her way up the cracked concrete path to the front door. The porch light flickered faintly, casting an uneven glow over the weathered wooden planks where she'd spent countless evenings, sipping tea and watching fireflies dance in the summer twilight. But tonight, the warmth of those memories felt distant, almost unreachable. Her key turned stiffly in the lock. Mark must have forgotten to oil it again, but the door didn't budge. Confused, Eleanor tried again, pressing harder this time. Still nothing. Frustration bubbled beneath her calm exterior as she leaned closer, peering through the frosted glass panel beside the door. Inside, soft lamplight illuminated the living room. Shadows moved across the curtains. A figure pacing back and forth, another seated on the couch. Someone was home. Relief washed over her momentarily. Perhaps Mark had come here after all, intending to surprise her. Or maybe one of the neighbors had stopped by to check on things while she was gone. Either way, she wouldn't be alone anymore. She knocked gently at first, then louder when no one answered. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering slightly. "It's me, Eleanor." Still, no response. Frowning, she rapped more insistently, leaning heavily on her cane for support. The movement inside continued unabated, oblivious to her presence. Panic began to creep into her chest. Why wouldn't anyone answer? Was something wrong? Eleanor sank onto the porch swing, wincing as her hip protested the movement. Pulling the thin hospital blanket tighter around her frail frame, she resolved to wait. Surely someone would notice her eventually. Surely. Hours passed, or perhaps it only felt that way. Time blurred together as the cold seeped deeper into her bones, gnawing at her resolve. Each breath fogged the air before dissipating into the darkness. Her fingers, curled tightly around the edge of the blanket, grew numb. Inside, the lights remained on, but the shadows ceased their restless dance, replaced by eerie stillness. Just when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, a distant bark pierced the night. A neighbor walking their dog approached along the sidewalk, pausing briefly to glance at the dark silhouette huddled on the porch. "Mrs. Westbrook?" the man asked hesitantly, his tone laced with concern. "Is everything okay?" Eleanor forced herself to sit up straighter, though every muscle in her body screamed in protest. "Oh, hello, Mr. Thompson," she said, recognizing the kindly retiree who often waved to her from across the hedge. I seem to be locked out." Mr. Thompson frowned, stepping closer. "Locked out? In this weather? Have you called your family?" "They're busy," Eleanor replied vaguely, unwilling to reveal the full truth. "I didn't want to bother them." He shook his head, muttering under his breath about stubborn independence. "You shouldn't be sitting out here in the cold. Let me call someone for you." Before she could protest, he pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood, growing louder until red and blue lights bathed the street in an unnatural glow. Paramedics rushed up the driveway, their expressions grim as they assessed the situation. One of them knelt beside Eleanor, wrapping a thermal blanket around her shoulders. "Ma'am, we need to get you warmed up. Can you tell us what happened?" "I'm fine," Eleanor insisted weakly, though her chattering teeth betrayed her. "Just a misunderstanding." The paramedic exchanged a glance with his partner, but didn't press further. Instead, he helped her to her feet, guiding her carefully toward the ambulance parked at the curb. As they loaded her inside, Eleanor craned her neck to look back at her house one last time. Lights still burned brightly in the windows, taunting her with their promise of safety and comfort just out of reach. As the ambulance sped away, Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic hum of the engine lull her into a fragile state of resignation. She had always prided herself on being strong, self-reliant. But now, surrounded by strangers in the sterile confines of yet another vehicle, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping further and further from the life she once knew, and the family she thought she understood. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and deep down, Eleanor feared she might never uncover the truth. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes in the hallway. Eleanor lay propped up on crisp white sheets, wrapped in a heated blanket that did little to dispel the chill lingering deep within her bones. Her fingers absently traced the edge of the blanket as she stared out the window at the gray morning sky. It had been years since she'd felt so utterly alone. A gentle knock at the doorframe drew her attention. Rosalie, one of the night shift nurses who had stayed late into the morning, entered with a warm smile and a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. She was in her early 50s, with kind brown eyes framed by laugh lines and hair streaked with silver pulled back into a loose bun. There was an ease about her, a quiet confidence that made people feel safe without needing words. "I thought you might like something warm to drink," Rosalie said softly, placing the mug on the bedside table within Eleanor's reach. "Not hospital coffee either. I brewed this myself." Eleanor blinked, surprised by the gesture. "That's very kind of you." "Thank you." Rosalie perched on the edge of the chair beside the bed, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "How are you feeling? Any better?" "Warmer at least," Eleanor replied, managing a small, grateful smile, "though I suspect my pride is still thawing out." Rosalie chuckled softly, the sound like music against the sterile backdrop of the room. "Pride can take its time. No rush there." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the hum of the machines filling the space between them. Then Rosalie leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but do you mind telling me how you ended up on your porch last night?" Eleanor hesitated, tracing the rim of the teacup with her fingertip. Part of her wanted to brush off the question, to downplay what had happened as mere miscommunication or bad timing. But another part, the part that had spent hours shivering in the cold while shadows moved behind frosted glass, felt the weight of unspoken truth pressing heavily on her chest. "My son and his wife. They weren't expecting me home," she began haltingly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said the children were sick, so I couldn't stay with them. And when I got to my own house," she trailed off, swallowing hard. "Well, let's just say I wasn't exactly welcomed inside." Rosalie listened intently, her brow furrowed with empathy. When Eleanor fell silent, she nodded slowly. "That must have been heartbreaking, especially after everything you've been through recently." "It shouldn't have come as a surprise, I suppose," Eleanor admitted, her gaze dropping to her lap. "Things haven't been the same between us for years now, but last night," she shook her head, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "Last night made me wonder if I even belong anywhere anymore." Rosalie reached out and placed a gentle hand over Eleanor's. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. Family. It's supposed to be a source of strength, not pain. But sometimes life doesn't work out the way we hope." Eleanor looked at her, searching her face for judgment or pity. All she found was understanding. "You know," Rosalie continued after a pause, "family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when no one else does. The ones who care enough to listen, to help, even when it's inconvenient. She gestured vaguely toward the bustling hallway beyond the door. This place is full of strangers, but every single person here wants to see you get better. That matters too. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. No one had spoken to her like this in years, not since her husband passed away and left her to navigate grief and loneliness on her own. Hearing those words now, spoken with such sincerity, stirred something deep within her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that perhaps her sense of belonging didn't have to hinge entirely on Mark and Jenna, or anyone else in her immediate circle. "I hadn't thought of it that way," Eleanor murmured, clutching the teacup tighter. "Thank you, Rosalie. Truly." The nurse smiled warmly, patting Eleanor's hand before rising from the chair. "Get some rest. You'll feel stronger tomorrow. And remember, you're not alone, even if it feels that way right now." As Rosalie slipped quietly out of the room, leaving Eleanor to sip her tea in solitude, the older woman found herself replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. Rosalie's words lingered like a comforting balm, soothing the raw edges of her emotions. Perhaps there was another path forward, one where loyalty wasn't tied solely to bloodlines or obligations, but to kindness and connection instead. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tentative spark that promised warmth amidst the cold. The rehab facility was a far cry from the hospital, quieter, more intimate, with faded floral wallpaper and creaky wooden floors that groaned underfoot. Eleanor's room overlooked a small garden where sparrows flitted between shrubs, their chirps mingling with the distant hum of conversations drifting through open windows. It wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful, a place to heal both body and mind. So, yet peace didn't come easily when memories lingered like ghosts in the corners of her mind. As she lay propped up in bed, staring at the ceiling tiles dotted with tiny imperfections, Eleanor found herself revisiting moments long buried beneath decades of routine and responsibility. They surfaced unbidden now, each one sharp and vivid as if they'd happened yesterday. She remembered the late nights spent bent over ledgers, poring over bills while Mark studied for his engineering degree. How she'd taken on extra shifts at the department store just to keep food on the table and tuition checks in the mail. Her husband had always joked that she worked harder than any two people combined, but he'd never begrudged her efforts. Not once. He'd understood what it meant to give your children a chance at something better. Then there were the years after his passing, when Eleanor became not only a mother, but also a surrogate parent to her grandchildren. Jenna had struggled with postpartum depression after Emma's birth, leaving Eleanor to step in without hesitation. She'd rocked Emma to sleep countless nights, changed diapers, prepared meals, and juggled school pickups, all while managing her own grief. And later, when Jake came along, she'd done it all over again. But the sacrifices hadn't stopped there. When Mark decided to start his own construction business, Eleanor had emptied her savings account to cover startup costs. "It'll pay off," he'd promised, eyes bright with ambition. For a while, it seemed like he might be right. But when the housing market crashed, so did his dreams, and hers along with them. Still, she hadn't hesitated to help him pick up the pieces, even refinancing her home to bail him out. And then there were the smaller gestures, the ones no one ever acknowledged but which added up over time. Paying for family vacations when finances got tight, covering car repairs when neither Mark nor Jenna could afford them, babysitting the kids week after week so they could attend work events or simply have a night off. Each act of kindness had been given freely, without expectation of repayment. Yet somewhere along the way, those acts seemed to vanish into thin air, forgotten by everyone except her. Eleanor sighed heavily, rubbing her temples as though trying to erase the thoughts swirling inside her head. Why was she dwelling on this now? What good would it do to dredge up old grievances? She'd made her choices willingly, hadn't she? Out of love? A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Rosalie peeked her head in, holding a clipboard and wearing her usual warm smile. "Just checking in," she said cheerfully. "How are you feeling today?" Better, thank you, Eleanor replied automatically, forcing a polite smile. Rosalie stepped fully into the room, noticing the faint crease of worry etched between Eleanor's brows. Something on your mind? She asked gently, pulling up a chair beside the bed. Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether to voice the tangled emotions knotting her chest. But there was something about Rosalie, her steady presence, her willingness to listen, that made sharing feel less daunting. I've been thinking about everything I've done for my family over the years, she began haltingly. All the sacrifices, the money, the time, the energy. And now, she trailed off, shaking her head. Now it feels like none of it mattered. Rosalie tilted her head, studying Eleanor with compassionate eyes. Do you think they've forgotten? It's not just that, Eleanor admitted, her voice thick with emotion. It's like I poured myself into them completely, gave them everything I had, and yet here I am, sitting in this room, wondering if I even belong anymore. Rosalie nodded slowly, absorbing her words. That must hurt deeply, especially when you've given so much of yourself without asking for anything in return. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. I don't regret helping them. Not really. But sometimes, I wonder if I lost myself in the process. You didn't lose yourself, Rosalie assured her firmly. You're still here, Eleanor, stronger than you realize. Maybe it's time to focus on what you need now, not what others expect of you. The idea struck Eleanor like a bolt of lightning. For so long, she'd defined herself by her roles: wife, mother, grandmother, caregiver. Who was she outside of those labels? Could she even remember anymore? As Rosalie stood to leave, squeezing her hand reassuringly, Eleanor felt the stirrings of determination flicker within her. Perhaps recovery wasn't just about mending her body. It was also about reclaiming her sense of self-worth, about finding a new path forward, one that honored the woman she used to be before life demanded every ounce of her strength. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future where she didn't live solely for others, but for herself. The faint scent of antiseptic mingled with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights as Eleanor sat in the common area of the rehab facility, idly flipping through the pages of a magazine she wasn't really reading. Her hips still ached from the fall, but physical therapy was slowly restoring her strength. More importantly, her mind felt sharper than it had in weeks, perhaps because she'd finally started asking herself questions that had long gone unanswered. A shadow fell across the table, pulling her attention upward. Mark stood there, hands shoved awkwardly into the pockets of his slacks, his tie slightly askew. He looked harried, as though he'd rushed straight from work without pausing to collect himself. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at him, taking in the lines etched around his eyes and the gray peppering his temples. She hadn't seen him in person since before her hospital stay, and the sight of him stirred a mix of emotions: longing, frustration, and something else she couldn't quite name. Mom, he said, offering a tight smile as he pulled out the chair opposite her. How are you feeling? Well enough, Eleanor replied evenly, setting the magazine aside. It's kind of you to visit. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding her gaze. Yeah, sorry I haven't been by sooner. Things have been busy. Eleanor nodded, though her expression remained neutral. Busy. Of course. That word had become a convenient veil for so many things over the years. Still, she didn't press him. Not yet. Instead, she gestured toward the untouched tray of cookies on the table between them. Would you like some tea or a snack? No, thanks, Mark said quickly, waving off the offer. I can't stay long. I just wanted to check on you and maybe talk about something important. Eleanor's heart sank, though she kept her tone light. Oh, what is it? Mark leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper despite the empty room. I'm thinking about starting another business, a tech startup this time. It's a solid opportunity, Mom. Really promising. The only thing holding me back is funding. Eleanor watched him carefully, noting the way his words tumbled out in a practiced cadence. His urgency was palpable, almost desperate, But what struck her most was the absence of any genuine concern for her well-being. Not once had he asked how her recovery was going, or expressed regret for leaving her stranded on the porch. No, this visit wasn't about her. It was about what she could give him. "I see," Eleanor murmured, feigning confusion as she tilted her head slightly. "And what does this have to do with me?" Mark hesitated, clearly thrown by her apparent lack of comprehension. "Well, I was hoping you might co-sign a loan for me, just temporarily until we get the company off the ground. You've always supported my ventures before. It's why I thought you'd understand." Eleanor let the silence stretch between them, studying his face intently. There it was again, that flicker of impatience beneath the veneer of politeness. His eyes darted toward the clock on the wall, then back to her, searching for reassurance. In that moment, she realized how much their relationship had shifted over the years. Once he'd sought her approval because he valued her wisdom. Now he came to her only when he needed something. "And I'm afraid I don't know much about loans these days," Eleanor said softly, leaning back in her chair. "All those financial matters were your father's domain. I wouldn't even know where to begin." Mark frowned, clearly unprepared for resistance. "But Mom, you've handled everything since Dad passed away. You're the one who took care of all our finances growing up. Surely you remember how it works." Her fingers tightened imperceptibly around the armrests of her chair. "That was a long time ago, Mark. People change. Memories fade." She paused, letting her words hang in the air before adding gently, "Besides, shouldn't Jenna be helping with this? She's always been so good at managing money." His jaw clenched briefly at the mention of his wife, and Eleanor caught the fleeting flash of irritation in his eyes. "Jenna doesn't think it's a good idea right now. She says we should focus on the kids' education fund instead." His tone carried a hint of bitterness, though he masked it quickly. "Which is why I need your help more than ever." Eleanor felt a pang of sadness, not for herself, but for the man sitting across from her. Somewhere along the way, Mark had lost sight of balance, of gratitude, of reciprocity. He saw her not as a person, but as a resource to be tapped whenever convenient. And while part of her ached to protect him, another part, the stronger, quieter part, knew it was time to draw a line. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice firm yet gentle. "But I can't promise anything, Mark. My health comes first these days." He nodded stiffly, though disappointment clouded his features. "Of course, I understand." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before Mark stood to leave, glancing once more at the clock as if eager to escape. As he bent down to kiss her cheek, a perfunctory gesture devoid of warmth, Eleanor closed her eyes, steeling herself against the wave of sorrow threatening to overwhelm her. When the door clicked shut behind him, she exhaled deeply, allowing the weight of the encounter to settle over her. For years she'd given freely, believing it was her duty to support her family no matter the cost. But now, sitting alone in the quiet room, she understood something profound. Giving endlessly, without boundaries, wasn't generosity. It was self-erasure. And Eleanor Westbrook was done erasing herself. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Eleanor's room, casting soft golden streaks across the bedside table where her phone lay. It was an unassuming device, one she rarely used except for occasional calls to family or friends. But today it felt like a lifeline, a tool that would help her reclaim control over her life. Eleanor picked up the receiver with trembling hands, dialing the familiar number from memory. After 3 rings, a warm voice answered on the other end. "Colby Financial Services. This is Mr. Colby speaking." "Mr. Colby," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside her. "It's Eleanor Westbrook." There was a brief pause before his tone shifted to one of genuine concern. "Eleanor, how are you doing? I heard about your fall. Are you feeling better?" "I'm managing, thank you," she replied politely, though her words carried an undercurrent of resolve. "But there are some matters we need to discuss. Important ones." "Of course," Mr. Colby responded immediately, his professional demeanor kicking in. "What do you need?" Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind countless times since Mark's visit yesterday. But now that the moment had arrived, the gravity of her decision pressed heavily on her chest. Still, she knew what needed to be done. I'd like to start by removing my son, Mark, and his wife, Jenna, from all my accounts, she began firmly. Effective immediately. There was another pause, longer this time. When Mr. Colby spoke again, his tone was cautious. Are you certain about this, Eleanor? These are significant changes. Yes, and I am, she said without hesitation. They've had access to my finances for years, for convenience mostly, but I believe it's time I take full control back. I understand, he replied gently. And your estate plan? Do you wish to make similar adjustments there? Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, bracing herself against the flood of memories that threatened to surface. The sacrifices, the late nights, the endless giving. Yes, she loved her son deeply, but love didn't mean losing herself entirely. Not anymore. Yes, she said finally, opening her eyes. Please remove them as beneficiaries as well. For now, I'd prefer to leave those decisions open until I've had more time to consider my options. Mr. Colby hesitated only a moment before responding. Very well. I'll get started on the paperwork right away. Is there anything else you'd like me to address? Eleanor nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Yes. I want to set up additional protections, something stronger than just revoking their access. Perhaps a trust or some form of legal safeguard to ensure my assets remain secure. That's wise, Mr. Colby agreed. We can establish a revocable living trust if you'd like. It will give you greater flexibility while providing an extra layer of security. That sounds perfect, Eleanor said, relief washing over her. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of agency returning, a quiet but undeniable strength rising within her. As they wrapped up the call, Mr. Colby assured her that everything would be handled promptly. Take care of yourself, Eleanor, he added warmly, and don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything else. After hanging up, Eleanor leaned back against the pillows, clutching the phone tightly in her lap. The weight of what she'd just done settled over her like a heavy cloak, but instead of feeling burdened, she felt lighter, as though she'd shed a piece of armor she'd worn for far too long. For years, she'd operated under the belief that loving someone meant sacrificing everything, including her own needs and boundaries. But now, sitting alone in her hospital bed, she understood the truth. Real love wasn't about erasing oneself for others. It was about finding balance, about protecting not only those you cared for, but also the person you were beneath all the roles and responsibilities. And Eleanor Westbrook was determined to rediscover that person, one step at a time. The sun rose gently over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold, as Eleanor Westbrook stood on the small patio outside her new apartment. The air carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine, mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil from the community garden below. It was a modest space, a one-bedroom unit with soft beige walls, polished hardwood floors, and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. But it felt like home in a way Eleanor hadn't anticipated. After weeks of deliberation and several tearful conversations with Rosalie, who encouraged her to prioritize her own happiness, Eleanor had made the decision to sell her house on Maplewood Lane and move into Serenity Grove, a senior living community nestled in the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood. At first, the idea had terrified her. Leaving behind the place where she'd raised her children, celebrated holidays, and mourned losses seemed unthinkable. But as she unpacked boxes and arranged furniture in her new space, she realized something profound. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Her first few days at Serenity Grove were filled with introductions and discoveries. On her second morning there, a cheerful woman named Margaret knocked on her door bearing a plate of homemade brownies. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she exclaimed, her eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed glasses. "We're having coffee in the lounge later. Why don't you join us?" Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before accepting the invitation. In the cozy common room, surrounded by laughter and lively conversation, she met others who had embarked on similar journeys, widows rebuilding their lives, retirees chasing long-forgotten passions, and even a former teacher named Harold, who insisted on reciting poetry during every gathering. Their stories reminded her that she wasn't alone, that life after loss could still hold joy, connection, and purpose. One afternoon, while exploring the grounds, Eleanor stumbled upon the community garden. Rows of vibrant flowers and vegetables stretched out beneath the warm sun, tended by residents wearing wide-brimmed hats and gloves. A young volunteer named Lily greeted her warmly, offering a pair of gardening tools. "Ever tried your hand at planting?" she asked with a grin. Decades ago, Eleanor had spent hours tending to her own backyard garden, nurturing roses and tomatoes until they flourished under her care. But somewhere along the way, between caring for grandchildren and managing family crises, the hobby had slipped away. Now, kneeling in the rich soil and feeling its cool texture between her fingers, she rediscovered the simple pleasure of creation. By the end of the day, she'd planted a small patch of lavender, a fragrant reminder of resilience and renewal. Inside her apartment, Eleanor began journaling again, something she hadn't done since her husband's passing. Each evening, she sat at the small desk by the window, penning reflections on her day, her memories, and her hopes for the future. Writing became a form of healing, allowing her to process emotions she'd buried for far too long. She wrote about Mark, not with anger, but with a bittersweet mix of love and acceptance. She wrote about herself too, reclaiming pieces of her identity that had been overshadowed by decades of selflessness. Slowly but surely, Eleanor began to feel more in control of her life than she had in years. Her mornings started with yoga classes in the activity room, followed by leisurely walks around the property. Afternoons were reserved for hobbies or socializing, whether it was joining a book club discussion or helping organize the monthly art exhibit. Evenings brought quieter moments, often spent sipping chamomile tea on her patio as the stars emerged one by one. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor allowed herself to dream. Not about obligations or responsibilities, but about possibilities. She signed up for a watercolor painting class, surprising herself with how much she enjoyed blending colors on paper. She volunteered at the local library storytelling hour for children, delighting in their giggles and wide-eyed wonder. And when spring arrived, she joined a group planning a trip to the botanical gardens, an adventure she never would have considered before. As weeks turned into months, Eleanor realized that moving to Serenity Grove hadn't just given her a new place to live. It had given her permission to live fully, to embrace the person she was becoming, stronger, wiser, and unapologetically herself. One crisp autumn morning, as she stood admiring the lavender bushes she'd nurtured all summer, Eleanor smiled softly to herself. Life hadn't turned out the way she'd imagined it would. There had been pain, disappointment, and loneliness, but there had also been growth. And standing here now, surrounded by beauty and possibility, she knew one thing for certain. This was her story, and she intended to write the next chapter on her own terms. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday afternoon when Mark Westbrook logged into his online banking app to transfer funds for an upcoming contractor payment. He tapped through the usual screens, entered his credentials, and waited for the account balance to load. Instead, a stark red message blinked across his phone screen. Access denied. Tom, what the hell? Mark muttered under his breath, frowning as he refreshed the page. Same result. His heart began to race as he scrolled through recent transactions, only to find the joint account he shared with Eleanor, once flush with funds, was now inaccessible. He called the bank immediately, his tone urgent. Hi, I need help with one of my accounts. It's saying access denied, but I'm listed as a co-owner. The customer service representative sounded apologetic, yet firm. I'm sorry, Mr. Westbrook, but our records indicate that your access has been revoked. You'll need to contact the primary account holder directly. The primary account holder is my mother, Mark snapped, frustration creeping into his voice. She's in rehab. Why would she revoke my access? I'm afraid I can't provide specifics, the representative replied. But if you'd like, I can connect you with our legal department for further assistance. Mark hung up without another word, his mind racing. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was catastrophic. Between the failed business venture and mounting bills, Their finances were already stretched thin. Without access to Eleanor's accounts, things could spiral out of control quickly. Meanwhile, across town, Jenna Westbrook sat at a bustling Italian restaurant with her sister and two friends, celebrating what should have been a lighthearted evening. When the check arrived, she handed over her credit card without a second thought. But moments later, the waiter returned, looking sheepish. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly, leaning down so only she could hear. "Your card was declined." Jenna's face flushed crimson as her sister raised an eyebrow. "Declined? Are you sure?" She forced a laugh, trying to mask her embarrassment. "It must be a mistake. Try running it again?" The waiter obliged, but the outcome remained the same. Jenna scrambled to pull cash from her wallet, though it barely covered half the bill. Her friends offered to pitch in, but the damage was done. For the rest of the meal, Jenna stewed silently, replaying the incident in her head. Something wasn't right. By Friday morning, the situation had escalated into full-blown panic. An email notification popped up on Jenna's phone while she sipped coffee in the kitchen. Mortgage payment failed. Immediate action required. Her hands trembled as she opened the message. Their monthly mortgage payment, an amount automatically deducted from their checking account, had bounced due to insufficient funds. How was this possible? They always kept enough cushion in the account to cover essentials. "Unless—" "Mark!" Jenna shouted, storming into the living room where he sat hunched over his laptop. "Did you know about this?" "About what?" he asked distractedly, still scrolling through documents. "Our mortgage payment failed, and my credit card got rejected at dinner the other night." "What's going on?" Mark froze, guilt flashing across his face before he masked it with irritation. "Yeah, I've been dealing with some issues. Mom changed something with the accounts." Jenna's eyes widened in disbelief. "Changed what? What are you talking about?" "She revoked our access," Mark admitted reluctantly, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know why. I went to see her last week and everything seemed fine, but apparently she's made some changes." Jenna stared at him, incredulous. "You mean she cut us off? Completely?" "I guess so," Mark mumbled, rubbing his temples. "I tried calling her, but she won't answer. No one at the rehab facility will put me through either. It's like she's deliberately avoiding us." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of Eleanor's actions settled between them, heavy and suffocating. All those years of relying on her, her money, her support, her unwavering presence, had lulled them into complacency. They had taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there to prop them up. Now, faced with the consequences of their neglect, they felt the ground crumbling beneath their feet. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding in her son's household. At Serenity Grove, she had embraced a routine of independence and self-care, filling her days with activities that brought her joy rather than stress. When the front desk receptionist mentioned a missed call from Mark, Eleanor simply smiled and said, "Thank you, dear. Let him leave a voicemail if it's important." She didn't listen to the messages. She didn't need to. Whatever crisis Mark and Jenna were facing, it was theirs to navigate, not hers. For the first time in decades, Eleanor allowed herself to prioritize her own peace of mind. If they wanted answers, they would have to come to her, not as supplicants seeking handouts, but as family members willing to rebuild trust. And until then, the locks would stay changed. The automatic doors of Serenity Grove slid open with a soft hiss, and Mark Westbrook strode inside like a man on fire. His tie was loose, his hair disheveled, and his face flushed with barely contained rage. He marched past the front desk without so much as a glance at the receptionist, who called out hesitantly, "Sir, can I help you?" "No," he snapped over his shoulder, not slowing his pace. "I'm here to see my mother." Residents lounging in the cozy common area turned their heads, curiosity piqued by the commotion. Some exchanged wary glances, others leaned forward slightly, intrigued by the spectacle unfolding before them. It wasn't every day that someone stormed into their peaceful community with such raw intensity. Eleanor was seated in her usual spot near the garden patio, sipping herbal tea and flipping through a gardening magazine. She looked up calmly as Mark approached, his shadow falling across the table. For a moment, she simply regarded him, her expression unreadable. Then, setting down her teacup, she spoke softly but firmly. "Mark, you're making a scene." His jaw tightened, and he glanced around briefly, clearly aware of the growing audience. But his anger outweighed his embarrassment. "We need to talk, now." "Very well," Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit." "I'm not sitting," Mark shot back, his voice rising. "What's going on, Mom? Why did you cut us off? Do you have any idea what this is doing to us?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her tone remaining steady. "Cut you off? From what exactly?" "You know damn well what I'm talking about," Mark exclaimed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "The bank accounts, the credit cards, the mortgage payments, it all traces back to your accounts. Did you think this wouldn't affect us?" A murmur rippled through the nearby residents, some shaking their heads disapprovingly at Mark's outburst. A staff member hovered uncertainly nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Eleanor ignored them all, focusing solely on her son. "Yes, Mark," she said evenly, meeting his gaze. "I knew it would affect you. That was precisely the point." His eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you talking about? We're your family. You're supposed to take care of us." At that, something shifted in Eleanor's demeanor. Just slightly, but enough for those watching to notice. Her lips pressed into a thin line and her voice carried a quiet authority when she finally responded. "Take care of you?" she repeated, her words measured and deliberate. "Is that why you left me shivering on my own porch in the cold? Is that how you repay everything I've done for you over the years?" Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Eleanor held up a hand, silencing him. "I paid for your education. I bailed you out when your business failed. I babysat your children while Jenna struggled. I gave you everything I had, all my time, all my energy, all my savings. And yet, when I needed you most, you turned your back on me. You told me there was no room for me in my own home because it was inconvenient." Her voice cracked ever so slightly on the last word, but she quickly steadied herself. "So yes, Mark," she continued, leaning forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "Now you'll know what it feels like to be left in the cold." For a long moment, Mark stood frozen, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. The weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave, leaving him speechless. Around them, the room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he managed to stammer, "Mom, I didn't realize." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Eleanor interrupted, her tone softer now, but no less resolute. "You never realized. None of you did. But maybe now you will." She sat back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. The fight seemed to drain out of Mark as he stared at her, shame and guilt flickering across his features. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor sighed deeply, her expression softening just a fraction. "I don't want anything from you, Mark. Not anymore. What I want is for you to figure out how to stand on your own 2 feet, to stop relying on me or anyone else to fix your problems. Until then," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Mark hesitated, clearly unsure of what to say or do next. The audience of residents and staff watched silently, some nodding approvingly at Eleanor's composure, others exchanging sympathetic looks. Finally, with a defeated slump of his shoulders, Mark turned and walked away, disappearing through the same automatic doors he'd entered minutes earlier. As the murmurs resumed and life in the common area gradually returned to normal, Eleanor picked up her teacup once more. Her hands trembled slightly as she brought it to her lips, but her resolve remained unshaken. She had drawn a line in the sand, a boundary long overdue, and though it pained her to see her son struggle, she knew it was the only way forward. For too long she had lived for others. Now at last she was learning to live for herself. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Eleanor's cozy apartment, casting a warm glow over the dining table where she sat with Mr. Colby. Papers were spread out before them, legal documents, financial statements, and handwritten notes detailing her wishes for the future. It was a task she had been dreading yet anticipating for months now, one that required both courage and clarity. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses, scanning the revised living trust document carefully. Each line represented not just a decision, but a declaration, a reclamation of agency over the life she had built and the legacy she wished to leave behind. For years, she had assumed her estate would go to Mark and Jenna, trusting they would honor her sacrifices and carry forward the values she held dear. But recent events had taught her otherwise. "This looks good," she said finally, nodding as she set the paper aside. "Thank you for guiding me through this, Mr. Colby." He smiled warmly, his pen poised above the final page. "It's my privilege, Eleanor. You've put a lot of thought into these changes, and I think it reflects exactly who you are and what matters most to you." She returned his smile, though her gaze drifted thoughtfully toward the window. Beyond the glass, residents strolled along the garden paths, their laughter mingling with the chirping of birds. Life here at Serenity Grove had shown her the importance of community, kindness, and purpose, qualities she wanted her legacy to embody. "I want to make sure everything aligns with my priorities," Eleanor began, her voice steady. "Education has always been important to me. I'd like a significant portion of my estate to establish scholarships for students pursuing degrees in teaching or social work. My late husband believed deeply in giving back to the community, so naming the fund after him feels fitting." Mr. Colby nodded, jotting down notes. "A wonderful tribute. What else?" "Animal shelters," Eleanor continued, her eyes lighting up slightly. "I've always loved animals, even if I never had the time to care for one myself. A donation to local shelters will help ensure fewer creatures suffer needlessly." "And what about personal bequests?" Mr. Colby asked gently. "Is there anyone specific you'd like to acknowledge?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her thoughts drifting to the neighbor who had found her shivering on her porch that fateful night. Mr. Thompson hadn't hesitated to call for help when others might have walked by unnoticed. His simple act of compassion had saved her life, not just physically but emotionally, reminding her that humanity still existed in unexpected places. "Yes," she said softly, her voice tinged with gratitude. "I'd like to leave a modest sum to Mr. Thompson. He doesn't know it, but he changed everything for me that night. Without him," she trailed off, shaking her head slightly. "Well, let's just say I wouldn't be sitting here today." Mr. Colby smiled knowingly, a thoughtful gesture. "Anything else?" After a pause, Eleanor shook her head. "No, that's all. These causes represent what truly matters to me. They're how I want to be remembered, not as someone's mother or grandmother, but as a person who cared deeply about the world and tried to make it better in whatever way she could." With those words, Eleanor picked up the pen and signed her name with deliberate strokes, sealing the document with a sense of finality. As Mr. Colby gathered the papers and slipped them into his briefcase, he glanced at her with evident admiration. "You've done something remarkable here, Eleanor," he said sincerely. "Not many people take the time to reflect on their impact or consider how their choices can ripple outward. This isn't just a will, it's a statement of your values." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Mr. Colby. That means more than you know." When he left shortly afterwards, Eleanor remained seated at the table, staring at the empty space where the papers had been. The weight of her decisions settled over her, but instead of feeling burdened, she felt free. Free from obligation, free from guilt, free to focus on the remaining chapters of her own story. Later that afternoon, as she tended to the lavender bushes in the community garden, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine the lives her gifts might touch. Children attending college because of scholarships bearing her husband's name. Animals finding loving homes thanks to shelter donations. And Mr. Thompson, perhaps using the money to travel or pursue a long-delayed dream. For so many years, she had lived for others, believing that love meant sacrifice above all else. Now she understood that true love, the kind worth leaving behind, was about creating opportunities, fostering kindness, and ensuring that the world became just a little brighter after you were gone. As she brushed dirt from her hands and stood to admire her handiwork, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. Her journey wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but for the first time in decades, she knew exactly who she was and exactly what she stood for. And that, she realized, was enough. News of Eleanor's decisions traveled swiftly through the Westbrook family like a ripple across still water. It began with whispers, hushed phone calls between cousins, siblings comparing notes over text messages, and Jenna venting to her own mother about how selfish Eleanor had become. By the end of the week, it seemed everyone had an opinion, whether they voiced it openly or kept it simmering beneath the surface. At first, the backlash came in waves. Some relatives were quick to judge, their disapproval cloaked in thinly veiled concern. Eleanor received emails from distant cousins she hadn't spoken to in years, lecturing her about loyalty and familial duty. One even went so far as to accuse her of abandoning Mark during his time of need, a claim that stung more than Eleanor cared to admit. "You're supposed to be the rock of this family," wrote one particularly scathing aunt. "Instead, you've thrown stones at your own son. How could you do this to him?" Eleanor read the message once, then deleted it without responding. She didn't owe anyone explanations, not when her actions stemmed from years of unacknowledged pain and sacrifice. Still, the criticism weighed on her, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. Was she wrong to draw boundaries? To reclaim control over her life? But not all reactions were harsh. Amidst the storm of judgment, quieter voices emerged, those who reached out tentatively, offering apologies rather than accusations. A niece Eleanor hadn't seen since Emma's 5th birthday sent a heartfelt letter expressing regret for staying silent all these years. "I always admired you, Aunt Ellie," she wrote. "You gave so much of yourself to everyone around you. I wish I'd said something sooner, that you deserve better." Even more surprising was a late-night call from Jenna's younger sister, Claire, who had often dismissed Eleanor's concerns as trivial in the past. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke. "I know I haven't been the best support system for you, Eleanor, and I'm sorry. If there's anything I can do now, please let me know." These small gestures of acknowledgement meant more to Eleanor than she expected. They reminded her that while some wounds ran deep, healing was possible, even if it started with just a few brave souls willing to speak up. The turning point came one crisp autumn afternoon when Eleanor answered a knock at her door to find Emma, her eldest granddaughter, standing there with red-rimmed eyes and trembling lips. The young woman looked startlingly grown up, her childhood curls replaced by sleek, straight hair, her gangly frame now poised and confident. Yet the vulnerability in her expression made her seem achingly familiar. "Emma?" Eleanor asked softly, stepping aside to invite her in. "What brings you here?" Without waiting for an invitation, Emma burst into tears, throwing her arms around Eleanor in a tight embrace. Caught off guard, Eleanor held her close, stroking her back as she murmured soothing words. "Shh, sweetheart, it's okay. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." "I'm so sorry, Grandma," Emma choked out, pulling back slightly to wipe her cheeks. "For everything, for not seeing what was happening to you, for letting Dad and Mom treat you the way they did. I should have done something. I should have stood up for you." Eleanor felt her heart clench painfully at the raw honesty in Emma's voice. She guided her granddaughter to the couch, sitting beside her and taking both of her hands in hers. "You have nothing to apologize for, Emma. You were just a child when most of this started. None of this is your fault." "But I wasn't a child anymore," Emma insisted, her voice cracking. "I knew something was wrong. I saw how tired you always looked, how stressed you were whenever you visited us. But I never said anything because—" She hesitated, looking down at their intertwined hands. "Because I thought it was normal, that this was just how families worked." Eleanor sighed deeply, squeezing Emma's fingers gently. "It's not normal, sweetheart, and it's not okay. But the fact that you're here now, that you care enough to say something, that means more to me than you'll ever know." Emma sniffled, managing a shaky smile. "Does this mean you'll forgive me, even though I didn't deserve it?" "There's nothing to forgive," Eleanor replied firmly, brushing a stray strand of hair from Emma's face. All I want is for us to move forward, to build something healthier, stronger, together. For the next hour, they talked openly about everything. The strained dynamics within the family, the weight of unspoken expectations, and the hope that things could change. Emma confessed that she had recently confronted her parents about their treatment of Eleanor, sparking a heated argument that left her feeling both guilty and relieved. In turn, Eleanor shared her journey toward self-discovery, emphasizing the importance of setting boundaries and prioritizing one's well-being. By the time Emma left, promising to visit again soon, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of connection, not just to her granddaughter, but to the possibility of reconciliation. Not everyone in the family would understand or agree with her choices, and that was all right. What mattered most was that some, like Emma, were ready to listen and to heal alongside her. As evening fell and the lights of Serenity Grove twinkled against the darkening sky, Eleanor sat alone on her patio, sipping chamomile tea and reflecting on the day's events. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she faced it with hope rather than fear. Because no matter what challenges lay ahead, Eleanor Westbrook knew one thing for certain. She wasn't walking it alone anymore. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the faint bite of frost as Eleanor knelt on the soft earth of the community garden. Her breath fogged the air before her, dissipating into the quiet morning stillness. Around her, the skeletal branches of dormant trees stretched skyward, their bare limbs etched against a pale gray sky. Yet despite the chill, Eleanor felt an undeniable warmth blooming within her, a quiet joy that had been missing for far too long. In her gloved hands, she cradled a small handful of tulip bulbs, each one a promise of spring hidden beneath the frozen soil. With careful precision, she dug shallow holes in the ground, nestling the bulbs inside before covering them with rich, dark earth. The act was simple but profoundly symbolic, a gesture of hope, renewal, and faith in brighter days ahead. As she worked, frost glittered around her like scattered diamonds, clinging to blades of grass and the edges of fallen leaves. It was a fleeting beauty, fragile yet resilient, an apt metaphor for her own journey over the past months. She thought back to the icy night she'd spent shivering on her porch, abandoned by those she trusted most. That moment had marked the beginning of winter in her life, a season of hardship and solitude that tested her strength and resolve. But now, kneeling here among the rows of sleeping plants, Eleanor realized that even winters eventually gave way to spring. And though snow might linger on distant hills and frost cling stubbornly to shadowed corners, the first stirrings of warmth were already taking root, not just in the soil beneath her fingers, but in her heart. "You're planting these awfully late," came a cheerful voice from behind her. Eleanor turned to see Lily, the young volunteer who often helped tend the garden, approaching with a basket of tools slung over her arm. "Won't they freeze?" "They might," Eleanor admitted with a wistful smile, brushing dirt from her gloves. "But if they survive, they'll bloom stronger than ever when the time comes." Lily tilted her head, studying the older woman with admiration. "That's kind of poetic, you know? Like you're betting on resilience." Eleanor chuckled softly, standing slowly and stretching her stiff joints. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just tired of waiting for someone else to bring color into my world. Sometimes you have to plant your own flowers." Lily grinned, setting down her basket to join Eleanor in patting the last mound of soil into place. "Well, whatever the reason, I think it's beautiful. These tulips are going to be amazing next spring." "They will," Eleanor agreed, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where sunlight struggled to break through thick clouds. "And not just because of how they look. They remind me that kindness can grow anywhere, even in places where cruelty once reigned." Her words hung in the air, carried lightly by the breeze as Lily nodded thoughtfully. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content simply to share the quiet companionship of the garden. Then Lily straightened up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Come on, let's get you warmed up. There's hot cocoa waiting in the lounge." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before nodding. As they walked side by side back toward the main building, she glanced over her shoulder at the freshly planted bulbs nestled beneath the frost-kissed soil. Though nothing stirred above ground yet, she could almost imagine the tiny shoots pushing upward, reaching for light they couldn't yet see. Inside the lounge, laughter and chatter greeted them as residents gathered around tables adorned with steaming mugs and plates of cookies. Margaret waved eagerly from across the room, beckoning Eleanor to join her group. Harold sat nearby, reciting lines from a Robert Frost poem about perseverance through adversity, a fitting choice for the day. Eleanor accepted a mug of cocoa from Lily, savoring its warmth as she settled into a chair among friends. Here, surrounded by people who valued her, not for what she could give, but for who she was, she felt a profound sense of belonging, one she hadn't experienced in years. Independence wasn't loneliness, she realized. It was freedom. Freedom to choose how she lived, whom she trusted, and what legacy she left behind. And while the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as reminders of how far she'd come and how much brighter the future could be. As she listened to the hum of conversation and watched sunlight finally pierce the clouds outside, Eleanor allowed herself a rare indulgence. Optimism. Spring would come again, bringing with it vibrant blooms and new beginnings. Until then, she would embrace the frost, knowing that even in winter, life persisted. Because Eleanor Westbrook had learned something extraordinary in the depths of her struggles. Kindness, like tulips, could take root anywhere, even in the coldest of seasons, and once planted, it had the power to transform everything it touched.